CEO of Heifer. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Brady Deaton, Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Missouri and former chair of the Board of International Food and Agricultural Development, known as IFAD. He also currently leads the Brady and Ann Deaton Institute for University Leadership in International Development. So welcome, Brady. Really happy to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with a slightly controversial quote, and I'll really be interested in your response to it. We have been working occasionally with a man called Jun Boras, who is an agricultural economist like you, but out of the Netherlands. And he's very much interested in smallholder farming, and we all are as well. And this quote is always perplexed us or actually challenged us. And this is it. He said, the dominant narrative in agricultural development asks the question, how can large-scale land investments benefit smallholders and the rural poor? And then he goes on and says, more appropriate, he believes, and the more difficult question is how can smallholder agriculture achieve the necessary scale so as to be able to feed the world while cooling the planet? And we're obviously not involved in large-scale agriculture. We're involved in smallholder agriculture all the time. But that particular perspective, I think, certainly animates us, and I think animates IFAD as well. And I was wondering what your comments would be on this idea of feeding the world, offering and creating large-scale smallholder agriculture, and cooling the planet. Those are quite complicated goals.
So you're putting the entire challenge of the future in front of us right here at the beginning.
Exactly.
So I appreciate that challenge, and I'm happy to share some thoughts. And I'm sure I'll not solve any major problems now, but I have watched, of course, the evolution in my own life here in this country, from growing up on a small farm in eastern Kentucky, where we depended almost exclusively on what we grew on the farm for our food. My father was a bricklayer, so we did have a little bit of external money, but watch that transformation over time. And today, as I was in pre-tractor technology and saw the evolution of tractor technology evolve in this country, and the large farms have grown with the transformation of agriculture here in the United States and many other countries around the world. The agricultural sector of smallholders is certainly feeding much of the world today, particularly in Africa and other parts of the world where the smallholder is a dominant force in feeding and in preserving the family and ensuring that there's a nutritious diet as they go forward. The problem of hunger in the world today that we're confronted with, both here in the United States and abroad, is not caught up in whether or not there's enough food supply available. For many years, we've had enough food in the world to resolve global hunger if it were distributed appropriately, but we know it's not. Larger farms have the scale to produce mass quantities of certain types of grains and other commodities in a major way, but that in no way enlists all the talents and creativity and family skills and family needs that are caught up in smallholder agriculture. Smallholder agriculture can be one of the most climate-friendly kinds of farming programs in the world. The climate-friendly aspects have to do with effectively engineering the agricultural sector, drawing on the latest science and technology to most effectively address the needs of carbon sequestration. Even as I'm saying that, I'm recalling that yesterday, and I saw the World Food Prize was given to Dr. Ratan Lal, a soil scientist now at Ohio State University, who predicted that, as you know, that we could, with a lot less land and a lot more soil knowledge, engage in a kind of cover crops and mulching and environmental friendly agriculture that were employed on many of the small farms, including our own, to some degree, when I was a child. And so there's nothing about the climate friendliness of it, I think, that's germane to large scale farming versus small scale farming. And no one solution fits global needs today. Large-scale farms produce a great deal of the world's food supply, and it's very important in a highly refined set of supply chains like we have in the United States and Canada. But the African continent, much of the Asian continent, and where I've worked in Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia, the small-scale farming is still a vital aspect of agriculture. And in fact, for many aspects of the agricultural sector, it's come back in its own realm as being a very productive and effective way to achieve the variety of diets and mainly to sustain the nutritional needs of families. These are family enterprises, and I think we can't forget that.
Mm.
And that transition from small-scale agriculture doesn't just lead to everyone leaving the small farm and being workers on large farms. Those things take place over time, and it's usually a generation or more. I know today I hear many people talking about the problem of youth leaving agriculture in Africa, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I would argue, is not necessarily a problem. It depends on the pace of change and the adoption of new science and technology on the small farms, and the integration of that small farm labor economy with the non-farm economy, even in the small villages throughout Africa and other parts of the world. So it's an issue that I think deserves very careful analysis. It deserves very careful scientific scrutiny, as do most of the complex problems in agriculture and in climate, for sure. So it's that juxtaposition is one that kicks off a lot of discussion, a lot of good thought, and it's the whole world is in many ways addressing it right now, thinking about it.
Yeah, the thing about soil is that we're now very focused on that, and we Heifer, as a matter of practice, have always used agroecological practices for obvious reasons. We've been very livestock centric. Livestock produces a lot of waste, which are, of course, if manured properly, can be put back into the soil, and you can improve the quality and fertility of the soil. I wonder if you have maybe the audience could help us too. Says my biggest worry about soil management, is that we don't have a low cost, rapid measurement device. When you're talking about, for example, we're working with 200,000 goat farmers, and they are, of course, growing forage and everything else for the animals. How do you measure 200,000 farms and the quality of the soil, et cetera? So technology that you just talked about in terms of managing the resource that feeds us all, right, which is soil and water. I wonder if you got any advice, or how should we go about finding, a $5 piece of machinery that can give us, give the farmer good indicators. It's I'm really being absolutely grassroots here. I'm not down to the weeds, but that's what we do. Yeah.
And I'm not sure I can provide a quick technology solution here to all the aspects you might want to look at with soils. I would emphasize that there is the knowledge and capability among scientists and the many students we have in our universities who can find innovative solutions to a lot of these aspects that we're looking at. And I think tapping that innovation and that entrepreneurship is very, very important in what we do. The issues of no-till agriculture, of various kinds of soil conservation techniques, using terraces, these have been in use for a long time, have been utilized very effectively by small-scale farmers, finding ways to put nutrients back in the soil, to take maximum advantage of photosynthesis by looking at the way in which we can, maybe with new genetic information, can change the composition even of the plants themselves to where they can absorb more sunlight. There's been some experiments done on that suggests that we may be able, with less chemical inputs, be able to provide just as much production by a different kind of technology, utilizing nature, utilizing that solar energy that is there all the time for our taking if we have the technology to do it. So new technologies, I think, are the domain of a new generation of students who are educated in our universities. And I would really emphasize the land-grant universities here and their role. But other universities today are recognizing, particularly with the issues of climate and the environment, are emphasizing the need to understand the biological domain that thinking is occurring in, along with the various other disciplines that can add up to new ways of thinking. So we have a lot of new technologies coming forward in a variety of areas that I think are going to make things very different in the future.
I agree. I think it's for us, it's to reach out to that kind of ecosystem is kind of new, but we will do that. I'm very optimistic about it. We just have to have the will. So I'm going to change. I'm going to change directions here, if I may. You were a Peace Corps volunteer,
right?
And the field of development, ag development, and other development is filled with people who had that experience 1 or 2 years. And I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about what that was like, and how it shifted your worldview, if it did. It's a fascinating, for me, it's fascinating to see how many people who have had that experience have actually come back and work in, alleviating poverty and suffering.
Sure, thank you. And yes, Peace Corps definitely changed my view and has really affected so much that I've done, even through university administration, the partnerships we've developed in various parts of the world. I've continued to go back to Thailand and still give speeches in Thai occasionally.
You'd
really?
So
those talents, really, it's been a life-serving tool. Yeah. But I grew up in 4-H club, very heavily influenced by the land-grant model from the earliest days on a hillside farm in eastern Kentucky. And I saw the International Farm Youth Exchange participants who would come back and talk about what it was like to work abroad. So I grew up with a very strong orientation for wanting to work or somewhere else in the world and learn a different culture, a different language perhaps, and broaden my thinking. So when I had the opportunity in 1962, I'd only finished 2 years of college actually, but I'd had a lot of experience working in agriculture.
Yeah.
And when the Peace Corps was created in 61, I immediately was interested in it and went to Thailand then in 1962. It was the second group that went there. And at that point, 2 years of college was about the level that many of the vocational agriculture teachers in Thailand had in these various schools of Thailand. So I was with a group of young men, principally at that time, who were teaching at the non-vocational agriculture school right up on the Laotian border, 2 years, 1962-64. I learned enough Thai to where I could conduct classes in Thai.
Oh, wow.
And with a lot of field work involved, and it was a wonderful experience. And I think what it did for a lot of us of that generation, and still does, I'm still a strong advocate of Peace Corps as a way for students to gain international experience. It gives them a window on another culture. Most importantly, it gives them a window on themselves. And they have the time to reflect on what this whole process of living and working with people around the world is all about. In my case, it focused on the nature of small-scale agriculture, principally in northern Thailand. And so I worked with a lot of Thai farmers. I would go out in the villages with teachers and engage in what we would call extension kind of activities today. And it was just a wonderful experience that when I came back then, I'd started out studying genetics, principally animal genetics. I was very much animal oriented, actually. And that's maintained an interest in that throughout my career. But I came back, switched into economics, agricultural economics, because it was clear to me then that we knew enough that if we could begin to allocate our resources more effectively, we could solve some immediate problems that we were seeing in the area in northern Thailand at that time.
Yeah.
So that became an important lesson for me. And I've continued to look at that. And even today, as we look at the public policy issues that we're working with around the world, we have the ability to use policy and technology in partnership with all the actors out there, the NGOs, government agencies, volunteer groups, faith-based groups, church groups, the cooperatives that you mentioned. If we can engineer that interaction and that communications, we will really move the world in a new direction at a time when it desperately needs that, with the kind of crises of COVID-19 and the continuing hunger that's in the world today.
Yeah. Yeah. Interestingly enough, one of the interesting aspects of Peace Corps volunteers when we're working with them is they understand, because they have been asked to, what it's like to be in the villages. I think the development sector and a lot of development teaching, I think they're theoretically very sound and very smart, but I don't think they've got that experiential understanding of what it's like to struggle every day.
Right.
I've got a great deal of affection for folks from the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Let me switch subjects again. Going back to EFAD, it's a bank, right? And it works with government. It's got more than a bank, but essentially it lends money to governments. Am I right?
Now, EFAD is different from BIFAD. I was chair of the Board on International Food and Agricultural Development, which is more of we're appointed by the president to advise the administrator of USAID. So in that sense, we look at all the programs that USAID may be involved in around the world.
Okay. My apologies. So the point I was going to raise was about the deployment of capital to smallholder farmers, the desperate need for working capital as well as investment in small infrastructure. You talked about tractors earlier. I would love to see and understand your comments or your perspective on that. The degree to which we can do it. We use sort of Wall Street approaches, which of course exaggerates the risks, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, I am very committed to the small capital approach. It's not divorced from the capital markets of the world, and I think that's something that we have to recognize. And when we look internationally and the need for capital at the local community level, whether we're even talking about forming a credit cooperative or some way of generating local capital, we have to understand the way in which it's linked with global capital markets. So I looked at an earlier program you had, in fact, in this series on patient capital, and I like that concept very much, let me say. And it's linked with a lot of work we've really done here in the United States as well. And of course, I think of Mohammed Yunus and his work with the really small scale lending of money. When that money is needed, it's needed for very immediate purposes, and in the longer term, it's got to pay its way back, or there may be some cost there the public sector or as a community we should be picking up. So one of the real challenges I think before us today is the recognition of what are really the costs involved in these diseases, for that matter, or the investments we make in One Health, for example, with the animals, to ensure that we capture those vectors and make the investments to reduce the cost that's going to impose on society long term. But that's a long way around to saying small scale investors are just key to small scale production enterprises. And we have the capability today to make a lot of partnerships through aggregating that capital and working with private sector firms or cooperatives to ensure that the investments are made over time in a way that adds up. And with patient capital, we can make the long-term investments that you aren't necessarily trading them on Wall Street, but you're making an impact on the productivity of a sector that does add up for the long term. Yeah. That may be a bit general, but I strongly feel that's vital that we understand it, because our solutions to agricultural development, and particularly in the light of COVID-19 and other kinds of problems that we've had, when we address the solution, we should be doing it in a way that is oriented toward the economic growth of whatever sector we're working with. And for too much of the time, we're trying to ameliorate a problem rather than looking at the components of that production system and saying we're going to solve that problem by making the kind of capital investments that are going to take us onto a growth trajectory down the road. And with the kind of long-term time frame that I know Heifer International has prided itself in doing, this can really make a big difference in the long run.
Yeah, no, we have a kind of a slogan. We call it creating or working to create pro-poor wealth creating value chains.
Yes.
You know, and this is the idea of making sure that the poor, the folks that we have been
Right.
told to take care of, are actually disproportionate beneficiaries of the wealth
Right.
that's created.
Right.
Otherwise, we'll be stuck with the kind of inequalities we have here in the United States at the moment. You mentioned co-ops. We really believe in co-ops.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what your perspective is on co-ops and the utility of co-ops in agriculture.
Well, I think cooperatives have played a very strong role in the development of agriculture, particularly in the United States. Clearly, they've gone well beyond agriculture now. But in my studies of agricultural development, historically, the role of cooperatives in the development of Southeast Asian nations particularly, or in Japan and Korea, as well as Malaysia, Thailand, Taiwan, these were all vital aspects of the building process. And it has the effect of bringing the individual themselves more in line, either the producer or the consumer, or a group of purchasers if it's a marketing cooperative. There's a joint commitment to the enterprise.
Yeah.
And then there's a joint benefit from it. So to me, they are vital. And I've followed a bit the milk cooperatives in India. My colleague, Mike Cook here at Missouri, does a tremendous job in leadership of co-ops around the world, really. And he's been a colleague through much of my career and working with these issues. And have revealed the importance of them right now in Africa. I think that's becoming increasingly important in many, many countries.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The leadership issue of cooperatives is the issue that keeps me awake at night. And I would love if you could refer your colleague to me, and seeing, understanding his work, and maybe participating in the development of of an approach. We try to do it. I would say that I would give myself a B- in terms of the success, in terms of how we develop leadership and how we identify leadership and the whole governance issue. It really isn't about accounting or something. It's about this sort of entrepreneurial spirit and et cetera.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah.
On that point, I was going to say that cooperatives have really made progress through the years in developing a greater entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
I think they had it in the early days with the agricultural sector in this country, with whether they were purchasing or producing.
Yeah.
The dairy industry was very, very prominent in this regard. But there's a new sense now with the new generations of cooperatives that are structured differently, and this has revitalized some aspects of investments in the agricultural sector and in other sectors of the economy.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, essentially, we see co-ops as the vehicle to invest in. You know, they can. So on another piece, and then I'll let you go. But this is such a huge field, isn't it?
It is amazing. It is amazing.
It's an amazing field. I just.
What keeps us all excited.
It is exciting. You probably know Professor Goldberg out of the Harvard Business School.
Yes.
And so he was my teacher on agricultural economics.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Yeah. Anyway, the question of land titles, right?
Yes.
The ownership of land and being able to prove. And we had, as you probably know, Hernando de Soto out of Peru, writing very forcefully about these issues. And so what's your sense about that? And it's been a hard road.
It is, and it is a very vital issue. You've hit a very sensitive point with me, let me say.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, because I completed my PhD at the University of Wisconsin, was a research associate through that time at the Land Tenure Center, which was investigating land titling throughout Latin America, as you're probably aware. There's quite a history of that. Since then, I've been very, very interested in the evolution of the progress, really, and the evolution of the attack on land titling, particularly in the African countries, where history and tribal customs from way back have shaped the nature of that process. Actually, I had a second generation, my son, who's an agricultural economist at the University of Guelph that I've written some with. He actually was a Peace Corps volunteer in Lesotho and was caught up in some of the land title issues there at that time. I think it's one of the vital issues that needs to be addressed. We have brought this up in BIFAD with our discussions with USAID, that we should be examining the impacts of it very carefully and doing more to ensure land titling, and particularly because it can empower women. And we know that if we empower women, we have a tremendous multiplier effect on poverty reduction in the world. And that itself has caught us up in some great excitement, really, about how the legal framework and policy framework in a concerted way can go forward. I am baffled a bit by the lack of progress. In many ways, I understand the politics of it in one sense, but not in the bigger sense. With all these issues, we've got to decide where we're going. And with regard to the development of smallholder agriculture, for example, and the transition particularly, and the investments that a farmer can make. Land has always been one of the key foundations of investment in the agricultural sector by farmers in this country and other parts of the world. And I feel that we're doing a disservice if we do not give that full attention in addressing the development needs in Africa, particularly right now.
So if I may, I will send you the paper that we've written. We're actually doing tests in Honduras and Malawi. And yes, we're trying to connect through using a variety of technologies, including blockchain, to try and work with the governments. We're not trying to solve the whole government system. We're trying to solve it with the project participants or beneficiaries, and make sure that they have land titles so that they can actually access the credit, et cetera, et cetera. If I may, I'll send you the material we have, and I'd love some connections. But I didn't know that this was of particular interest to you, but I'm delighted that I found. And so I mean, I think we've come to our end of 20 minutes. We try to keep these short. You've been incredibly insightful, and I really appreciate your time. And let's stay in touch. And
thank you very much.
Yeah,
I'm honored to be part of the series, and I appreciate very much the opportunity.
Thank you, Brady. Appreciate that. And we'll see you next week, everyone. Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Brady.
Bye.